So to get to some kind of, maybe not a conclusion, but to introduce again a little bit how we have been thinking through the exhumations going on in Spain and Poland and Bosnia through these theoretical model that we have and that we are working with. So to remind you, one of these modes or modalities is we call antagonistic memory. So that is very simply a model of good and bad, the good guys and the bad guys. Black and white, mostly the discourse around it is about heroes, and many times it has to do to a certain extent with national belongings or belonging or identity building to a certain extent. And the second mode that we use as like a thinking frame is the cosmopolitan mode, which it's also about good and evil, but it's rather about good is then related not to us, but to democracy. Or democracy is good and totalitarianism is bad. And instead of focusing on heroes, it focuses on victim stories. And the whole emotions that are that work through this mode are compassion with the victim. So this would be a mode that I think is the hegemonic memory mode in the European Union. And it also has been built up through Holocaust memory modalities. And then the third mode that we are trying to think of how that could work, that we call agonistic memory, that tries to accommodate possible conflicts of memory within a debate or a forum of acknowledging that, okay, we have opposing views, but we will live together and we will understand to a certain extent the context of our differing views. So here it's all about social and historical context. I think that is really important, and it's also about dialogue. And when we think of the emotions that are worked in this mode of remembering, is the solidarity to a certain extent. So I've been working and thinking more on how to understand, for instance, Poland through these modalities, and I've tried to understand, okay, what the memory of Katyn is, how these exhumations have been influencing that memory. Wagner is another important moment, and now these exhumations in Polonsky Cemetery and mostly exhumations for the cursed soldiers, although what I've been studying is a really specific moment, I think, in the exhumation of the cursed soldiers, which is not so much what Krzysztof was talking about, but afterwards, so after the government change in Poland, so that is really like the extreme right taking over those exhumations.
You hit the right time.
And so, thinking through these modalities, I have the feeling that in Poland, after the transition to democracy, so after 1989, they worked in a certain, or they worked on memory politics that were inspired by the cosmopolitan mode, also because they were working towards the integration in the European Union. It was the focus on the victims of totalitarianism on one side, on the other side, finding the graves of Katyn, families were important, finding the relatives, and that this cosmopolitan mode gives even the possibility of introducing the voice, or maybe to a certain extent understanding perpetratorship when Jedwabne, the discussion gets in there, because all of a sudden it is a difficult discussion, but it still was contained within a democratic arena. And that since the governmental change in Poland in 2015, everything has collapsed, and the only thing left is basically this antagonistic memory mode that prevails, and this history of Poland now is portrayed in a story of heroes and villains, black and white. And just in the break we were talking about that there is such a big shift between the two sides in Poland that it's not only that there is a abyss between the two sides, even the dialogue is not possible anymore. So that would be really this antagonism going on. And I think what we have understood from Amir, that to a certain extent in Bosnia there is also still a lot of antagonism between the different groups that were fighting each other during the wars in the 90s. And that it's also very difficult to even imagine a context in which there would be dialogue between those groups, or maybe very small instances in which, for instance, this poet that you mentioned, who is, coming from perpetrator group, finds this compassion with the other. And in Spain, this we have been debating a lot.
One more thing about Bosnia is that the arrival of international organizations has kind of brought in the cosmopolitan mode into Bosnia. But we don't know to what extent this has really leaked down to the logics of memory building in Bosnia. So this is something we wanted to pose to you, because obviously the ICTY is cosmopolitan, because it's kind of hegemonic, it's victim center and whatnot. So to what extent this fits into more antagonism on the ground, or opens up different ways of relating to the past, opening up so this is, the tension we, Amir sent us this report, and according to the report we have read very carefully, and we see that there are like these two memory modes working almost in parallel, but also with connections. And I don't know exactly if you can help us understand if this process is, that we understand it, or is even more complex, which probably is.
Sorry. And in Spain, we think that generally the exhumations, they bring about also working or building up a memory that is related to this cosmopolitan memory. There is a lot of international links, there is links to human rights, and also really focused on the suffering of the individual victim. But at the same time, we see also that within this cosmopolitan way of making memory, there are some kind of pushes or some moments or instances which we could call agonistic. So where there are kind of attempts to bring about discussions with the other or with your adversary, let's say. While before the exhumations, it was rather an antagonistic memory mode where there was still a little bit the story of good and bad, which was relying on the way history was told during the dictatorship. But the most difficult thing with the exhumations, we see clearly exhumations, they cater for victims. So the focus is always on victim stories. And agonistic memory tries to find a lot of voices. So how can you think of exhumations and the space around exhumations that creates also a place where to a certain extent the perpetrator is contextualized, the voice of the perpetrator is heard. Is that possible, or does that happen? Do people want that, or is the perpetrator just like a bad person who is hardly not a human anymore? And so that is, yeah, I think just the space of exhumations is a space of victims, and difficult to think of the voice and the space and the contextualization of perpetrators in that realm. So we're still struggling with that. Where would that agonistic memory be? So this is, yeah, it's quite theoretical.
The thing is that we are not sure that the model help us understand the complexity of the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Because we don't know to what point it kind of squeezes our data into like 3 lines, and the situation is more fluid, so to speak. There are like crossovers, and people can move, from one mode to the other, and countries in 10 years can shift, globally. And so we asked, I think that I mentioned this very briefly this morning, we have asked the theory people to provide us with a more dynamic model, which kind of allows us to understand better, because now we feel that it's kind of it forces us to squeeze in our data into it. So, but even with that, as we have to work with the model, we wanted to have your input, in what Marije was saying, how you see memory politics in your country, and if you see that this brief lines that Marije has drafted makes sense to you in your own context.
I don't think it makes much sense, to be honest. I mean, it sounds very utopian, and I can only speak for Poland, but there should be a need and a kind of political willingness for creating this the space of this agonistic, agonistic memory, but I don't see such political will in Poland at the moment, to be honest. So it's a nice model, yes. It's very idealistic in a way, yes, to bring all the voices and give them like equal possibility of being heard. But I don't think in contemporary situations it's really plausible. Let's say maybe this will change, but not at the moment.
I think that the problem is that the in Poland is so deep and deepening that's the one problem, because it's the rift is so big and the polarization is so big. It's so big in very different dimensions, not only with regard to history, but in many dimensions. And the other problem with trying to propose this agonistic model is that I don't see any part of the debate who would be willing to represent the perpetrators.
Oh, yeah.
Because we are speaking about the crimes which were committed some 70 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, 70 years ago. 70 years ago, and which had been condemned already as early as 1956. And then, even the communist regime distanced itself from the Stalinist period in 1980s during the martial law and under Jaruzelski. They distanced themselves from the. So we cannot see anyone who would be willing to try to represent the other side. So I think what we can achieve in Poland is to return to this model which we call cosmopolitan. And let me make the remark that our project of exhumation at Powązkowski Cemetery, at the very beginning, I think it was conceived exactly along this line. And Łukasz Kamiński, who was at that time the president of the Institute of National Remembrance, and it was his his personal idea.
Mm-hmm.
It was his personal initiative. He very often reiterated that his idea of the institute is that the institute serves the victims. So the problem is also the project was very victim oriented from the very beginning, and also what made it closer to the model you mentioned was that it was oriented on victims of totalitarianism. The official name of the project was a project of searching for unknown burial places of victims of totalitarianism, because from the very beginning we assumed that it would not only encompass the burial places of the people who were victims of communism, but also unknown burial places of the Second World War victims. And this happened, for instance, in Białystok, where there was another big project of exhumations with some, I think, 300 bodies which were recovered. And this was in the former garden of the prison, where the Germans buried their victims during the war, and then it was taken over by the communist regime, and the victims of the communist regime were buried at the same area, and we couldn't differentiate it during the excavations. All the bodies were recovered, and attempts were made to identify them. And among these those who were identified in recent years, there are also people from Białystok who were the victims of the Nazi terror. So the project from the very beginning was conceived as more universalistic than only focused on the communist regime victims.
I cannot imagine including the voices of perpetrators of communist crimes in the current political debate in this model, really. Because I think this would be paying tribute to the government, which really started this kind of witch hunt for communists, including degrading generals from military ranks from communist times. So recently, for instance, I think it was the parliament that passed a bill that simply degraded generals who introduced martial law in Poland. So this was the General Jaruzelski, and he is no longer a general. He was stripped of this title, simply. So I think this is like a hunt for those people who are. I mean, he's no longer alive. He died a few years ago. But really, if you would like to introduce those voices and have their voices heard, this would add fuel to the fire in a way. And it would make the whole debate even more antagonistic, and it would be used instrumentally by the current government, simply.
But there was an element of this, a very tiny element of this agonistic approach present in the process of moving away the graves, which I mentioned.
Yes.
This is. Can I on the drawing to show you how it was? It's difficult to explain. No. Check here. So maybe you continue. I will draw what I want, and then I will explain the drawing.
Okay.
Because I don't want to keep you super looking when I'm drawing.
But there's also something like a climate or an atmosphere, political atmosphere, and it's hard to say why, in the 90s, this was the time of cosmopolitan memory, that it could prevail, let's say. And also the slogan in the 90s in Poland was let's choose the future, yes? So let's not deal with the past, let's choose the future. This was the slogan of Aleksander Kwaśniewski, who was elected the president of Poland. But now it seems, and it's hard to explain, this is this kind of aura of the times, is the spirit of the times, that it's not about the future. I mean, the debates are not future-oriented so much. They are very much past-oriented. And even if they are, about the future, they are still, we are immersed very much the political discourse in Poland, the public discourse in Poland, has been swallowed in large proportion by those historical debates. So I mean, it's not this time, you know, it's not the mood of the times, whether, you know, this is kind of magical
way of thinking.
Mode of thinking, but there is no, let's say, climate, political climate for introducing this kind of mode of memory and to make it function, really, to make it stick.
But the thing is that we have mentioned the issue of the perpetrator, but it's not the only one. It's like, for example, one big trait of agonism is it has to be counter-hegemonic.
Okay.
For example, open up to new forms of multi-perspectivism without falling into moral relativism. So, I mean, the lines are very thin. And for example, just to move to the Spanish case, we understand that mostly, in this model, which we are discussing, basically human rights, international law is connected to the cosmopolitan mode. I mean, in broad terms. No? So, for example, if we look at the way in which ARMH, Emilio's association, works, we can say, okay, they are in a cosmopolitan mode because they use this international law, they talk about disappearance, for disappearances and whatnot, it's victim focus and whatnot, but at the same time, the modus operandi of RMH, which is basically to explore the contradictions of the system, to expose the contradictions of the system all the time, is pretty agonistic. So because it's counter-hegemonic, it's trying to kind of produce a state of opinion which kind of becomes critical of the main memory frame that we have now, which is that the transition to democracy in Spain was a total success, that it should be exported, that reconciliation was achieved during the transition. So then you basically throw exhumations to the face of this narrative. No? You say, okay, what about these people that was forgotten and whatnot? And so this is like, so what we are proposing, for example, the theoretical framework is that you can work within a cosmopolitan framework. I don't know, Emilio, if you agree with this, because I'm talking about you particularly as an agonistic sniper. We talk to you
agonistic sniper.
Because Emilio is very, so he invents an action and he puts it out in the public space and it creates contradictions. And then he just says, okay, let it work. And then little by little, he's kind of curtailing the dominant hegemonic memory plot in Spain, which is that, I mean, the success of the transition to democracy. And it's kind of falling apart at this point. It's called the regime of 78, so it's not just only about perpetrators being in the public space, but also about multi-perspectivism, also about self-reflexivity, to understand that your narrative is historically constructed, and other narratives you are fighting against are also historically constructed, that there are political agendas behind. So being reflexive is also a way of being agonistic. So there are a number of elements in this mode that can be also applied, because, for example, antagonism is not reflexive. It's like we are good and they are bad. That's it. No. Cosmopolitanism is self-reflexive, but it has become hegemonic and a form of common sense. So everybody kind of assumes it as true or whatever. No? So agonism would go one step beyond that. So that's.
But how can you impose self-reflexivity on?
No, it's not about imposing. This is one problem we have. This model is just normative. It's like we want to produce agonism in society, or it's just a descriptive term that we can use to analyze certain elements and try to understand better what's going on, and how memory modes kind of fall apart at some point, because the narrative of the transition to democracy now is under siege in Spain. You know, like 15 years ago, it was kind of like everybody thought in these ways. Now, it's not working anymore. At least for the generation of the grandchildren, a lot of them are like, this is not. We are not buying this narrative of the past anymore. No? So, and that's about reflexivity also.
Located here, and now we can see that during the first stage, this is square. As I mentioned, it was 18 by 18 meters. And during the first stage of exhumations, graves were found here. There's the blue ones you can see. But it turned out that the rows of graves are continuing in this direction, and in some cases in this direction. So we didn't know. And on this area, which is this and this, there were these new graves from 1980s. And at that time we didn't know how much into this field the rows of graves continue. So during the second stage of exhumations, this area under the asphalt-paved footpath was explored. And so about 100 bodies were found here, and another 100 here, and also here in the free spaces, which were also explored. But to check whether there are more graves here or here, all these fields, this and that, had to be moved to another, graves from these fields had to be moved to another direction. And there were altogether 200 graves on these two plots. And when I mentioned that there was an element of agonistic approach, I mean that after the necessary amendment to the law about the cemeteries was made, it provided that the provincial governor of Warsaw can issue a decision for moving the graves, but first he had to negotiate with the families of the people whose relatives were buried there. And the law provided if there are no consensus, if no agreement is reached, then the provincial governor can issue a special decision to move the grave forcibly. And the provincial governor very well prepared for these negotiations, found the addresses of the relatives, gave special training to his employees, and these negotiations proved very successful. I think only several families didn't agree to move their graves. So there was a dialogue with the people who, well, it's not, they didn't represent the perpetrators, but they had no emotional family ties to the victims. They were rather connected, related to the people who were members of the establishment during the communist system. I'm not saying that these people buried here and here were perpetrators. Some of them were. But the majority of them were officers of the army, and as a rule, Communist Party members, because at that time all officers of the army had to be Communist Party members. So I think in this process, which has turned out to be very successful, we can see an element of the dialogue with the other side.
Actually, when we talk to the theory people, sometimes we end up talking about agonistic moments. So we don't see agonism as a mode, but as moments that suddenly sprout in public space. And so that's also one of the. So we kind of. I mean, the latest we have is that agonism is relational. So it has to be counter hegemonic to something, and it depends on what this something is. So this is basically where we are. What about Bosnia? What do you see? You don't have to use the terms. It's just it makes sense to but there are like two different ways of approaching the issue.
I would say that if you want to have such approach in Bosnia, you have to get rid of the emotions from each side. And that's not possible. I think
it's exactly what Admir said. It's not possible.
It's definitely not possible, at least in this short period. I think it could be possible after 100 years or so, when there is no relative that actually really connect them with the crimes and with the victims or with the perpetrators. And dialogue like that could be only achieved on the right level when there is no emotional attachment to the process.
But what I found, but then I actually had to leave one moment, but when you were talking about the need of the voice of the perpetrator to actually point at the different exhumation sites, like before they die, they say, this kind of confession. That can, I don't know how that is, in what kind of space is that happening, or how that...
It's just confession. Most of them, they were asked before the same question, they didn't answer. Well, on the end, it probably doesn't matter to him anymore, so it just gives info. Where it could be, as a dialogue, way too soon.
Yeah.
Way too soon.
So, in case of Pedro, like a lot of, as I tell, a lot of people were prosecuted for the crimes that they committed or took part in. So, some of them confessed in front of ICTJ and said, okay, I participated in this crime, but this confession didn't have any influence in the public space in this town. It was not any influential to the government, or they did nothing. So it's like it never happened. One of them confessed because he was kind of like afraid of bad karma, because his daughter died or committed suicide, and he wanted like kind of like get rid of this negative energy that is around his family. He was kind of like this person. So that's why he confessed. From the other side, probably you know, like in Bosnia we have a Sarajevo Film Festival. And within this festival, a few years ago, they started the Dealing with Past program. And inside of this program, they have this so-called true story market. So they are kind of like searching for stories who will be presented there, and maybe some producer will catch up and make something about with these stories, some documentary, reportage, or even movie. So 2 years ago there was a presentation, or actually there were several presentations, but last year in this Dealing with Past program there was a screening of the so-called documentary Unforgiven is the name of the documentary. It was produced I don't know, by a director from Denmark. He was following the story of one perpetrator. He was guard in one detention camp. He was Bosniak, and the detention camp was for Serbs, close to Sarajevo, Čelebić, in Konjic. His name is Esad Lanđo. So that perpetrator, he was tried in ICTJ. He got his sentence. He had his sentence. He was in Finland in jail, and after that he was kind of like during this documentary, he is telling his story how he kind of like was empty and wanted to face the victims again and ask for forgiveness from them. So that's one like interesting moment in Bosnia, because before that I haven't heard, because maybe it happened before also, but I haven't heard about this kind of approach. So a perpetrator is going to the victims and telling, okay, I was 18 years old, I was fed up with this nationalistic rhetoric, I hated every Serb, I committed crimes, would you forgive me? So, and you can really see the painful, like the trauma in these victims. Some of them, two of them actually, they are now living in Montenegro, hiding with other identity. They were like in front of the other detainees. They were sexually harassed by this guy, so they didn't forgive him. They didn't want to show up to see him. Others, they showed up and saw him and
one forgives him, but the others didn't. So, which is, I think, also important for the process in Bosnia. But also, for example, there are many cases of clashing memories or like commemorations, because one date can mean different to each different groups. So it can be commemorated or celebrated as liberation or as start of occupation. For example, in the city of Prijedor you have the few key dates. One of them is 29th April 1992, when the Serbs took over the municipality and the police. Although the mayor was elected in the election, he was Bosniak, he was later killed in a detention camp. They took over the of the municipality, and they celebrated it like, okay, that we kind of like protected our town, something like that. On the 30th of May, there was attempt from the Bosniak side to again win back the municipality and the core buildings, governmental buildings in the city, and they attacked the city, and this is perceived as attack to the city. Not the takeover from the Serbian side, but when the Bosnians tried to get back the institution, it was perceived as attack. As a consequence of this, Bosniaks were ordered to, and Croats, non-Serbs, were ordered to wear like white ribbons on their leaves when they leave their houses and mark their houses. So it was the beginning of ethnic cleansing of the city area from Bosnia. So after 30th May, a lot of them who attacked Bosniaks were killed from the Serb forces. They were like stronger. It was a Yugoslavian public army mostly. They had heavier guns and a lot of civilians were killed. So every 31st of 30th May, so the local government is celebrating this as commemoration, in sense of like commemoration of those fallen soldiers who were killed during the attack of Bosniaks. And the 31st May is known as the kind of like commemoration, white ribbon, called White Ribbon Day. So activists and family members of victims, civilian victims, get together and kind of like protest against this approach for not dealing with the past from the local government, and to protest against the situation, because in the city center we don't have any monument that is dedicated to civilian victims, especially to for example, kids, children, and so it's kind of like going in this direction, fight for the monument for the killed children. There are regarding to monuments, there are like also positive examples. For example, in the city of Konjic, which is also close to Sarajevo, around 30 kilometers, there is a monument dedicated to killed children. The monument is kind of like inclusive. There are names from each ethnic group. So it's not like one-sided. And also like in this monument, what is for me interesting, one kid is included. There's written he died 1996. And we were asking why 1996, because the war stopped. Like 1995, there were no fightings. The kid is included because he died while playing and he stuck on a mine. This kind of like consequence of the war. So which is also kind of like inclusive and for me okay. And it's built in front of the Centro primary school, which is also a message to the kids to remember their colleagues who were killed. So but also this fight is happening, for example, in the village of Ahmići, is in middle Bosnia. It was the conflict between Croats and Bosniaks, and crime were committed from the Croat side in a Bosniak village, and you have when you go, you take the main road to Sarajevo from anyway of this middle Bosnia to Sarajevo, and you have to pass the village. The village is on your left side is when you go to Sarajevo, and by the mosque you will see a monument for killed Bosnians. But from the other side, on the main road, you will see a big cross that's dedicated to the killed Croat soldiers, which is kind of like I don't know, telling the like the Bosniaks are a little bit, I don't know, like not so on the road, like not so visible from everybody else. But the Croat soldier victims are kind of like really visible, and the cross is lightning during the night. It's lighting, which is also for me interesting. So basically, all the narratives,
but that's a kind of competition then, right?
Yes, competition, marking territory, and is that because and the issue in Bosnia, if you maybe you have watched the movie No Man's Land. It's the Oscar-winning movie from Bosnia, and I think all the memories that is built on the wall is kind of like founded in the who began the war, like who started the war, like because all the narrative is built on that, like because the narrative in Pedro tells like some from the international community came here and like told us lies, and we started fighting. And for many years before we were like best friends, they would say that. The Bosniak side will say like, oh, remember Sanu, the decree from the academy in Serbia that Bosnia is part of Serbia, and that you should like they plan to remove 1/3 of Bosniaks, 1/3 kill, 1/3 to remove from Bosnia, 1/3 kill, and 1/3 let them be because they will get to be a minority. So it's actually a true document. It was in the Academy of Science in Serbia. So that are some processes that are going on in Bosnia. It's related to which territory is it, and who began the war, and this process of unforgiveness and language for me is unique and positive.
There is a funny thing. Majority of people actually don't know why the war actually started.
Yeah.
There was one funny documentary of a soldier online in occupied Sarajevo. He was a young boy of about maybe 20, 21 years. And the reporter asked him, "Why are you fighting?" And he said, "I think maybe because they're angry on us somehow." That's his answer. I think he's angry and we have to fight back. The real reason it's for majority actually unclear.
And also who has the right to be the first victim, because always like the first victim in which category they are, but like they are the most victims. For example, in there is a story that Radenko Đapa, a young police officer who was killed under unknown circumstances, is used as this like, okay, Serbs were the first victims in Prijedor, and also adding to this narrative of attack on the city, and then that's the justification why to kill 3,156 persons.
I have one question for Emilio, because we are running out of time, and I wanted him to bring back to the discussion. I mean, you've been fighting now for 18 years, if you were to imagine the perfect, memorial mode in which Spain should be at this point, what element would you envision, in terms of the quality of democracy in Spain? What would have to happen, for this to...
I think About this dialogue between memories of the victims and the perpetrators, the ideal place is a court. Yes?
Exactly.
I want to listen the perpetrator and the victim there. In Spain, it's impossible to talk outside the place who create the criminal, because the perpetrator, because we are going to the place and the grave he creates, and we have to dialogue, perhaps not with words, but we have a dialogue there with facts, no? And it's impossible no listen his facts in exhumation, no? And I think the ideal place is there. I think is in the exhumation is the beginning of the funeral, and I think this is a place for relatives, friends, and people of the community, the near people of the relatives, no? But the ideal place is with un intermediario, que no sé cómo decirlo, with a judge, no? I want to listen, or perhaps also is more complex because there is another subject in this conversation, the killed people. Perhaps we need a trialogue because they are talking what happens with me. I have a hole here or a broken bone, and also they have a narrative, a physical narrative about what happened with my body, no? But we have some years ago we exhumated a mass grave in the north of Spain, and the grandson of one of the killers phoned to the association and say, I want to help. And we phoned to the relative of the people killed there, and we said, the grandson of one of the members of the Falange want to help you to open the grave of your grandfather. And the grandson said, we don't want to know nothing about these people. Kick what they want to came here to the place of the exhumation. And we say to the grandson of the perpetrator, they don't want to see you there. But he came, and during the exhumation, one Belgian filmmaker was making a documentary there, and they centered the history in the story of the grandson of the perpetrator and the grandson of the missing person in the grave, and they changed all the project, and the title of the documentary is Grandchildren, because the history. But I think about this question, I don't have interest in the narrative of the perpetrator. They talk everything when they kill the people. They break the dialogue, and I think I don't. All the things they have to say are in the grave. All the things, the kind of dialogue, what a project of country, the heritage they left to my country. They say a lot of things, and I don't. For me, it's not interesting. Listen, words around this fact.
But for example, once you told me that if we can reveal this, that you wouldn't mind talking to the president of the association, Paracuellos.
Yes.
Which these Paracuellos, we talked a little bit this morning, I think. There was a Republican massacre in the outskirts of Madrid, very close to the airport. So, but that's because they are also clearly victims.
He's not a perpetrator. He's victim of another violence or another group, but he's not a perpetrator. I think when I was when my grandparents' grave was open, any of them, or the perpetrators, lived in the 2000. But some years ago, I was in a house of one person who knows my family, and I was talking about the perpetrators with 3 or 1, and in one moment, one of them say, I have to go home. Okay. And she go out, and when she opened the door of the house to go out, she told me, I knew your grandmother, and go home. And later, one of the women say, this is the widow of one of the men who killed your grandfather. I was talking about them during a lot of time, because I was looking for information, and this one was sad. Perhaps he was a victim of the perpetrator, because I listened some arguments of the right party in Spain, and I don't want to listen anymore. No. I think because to have a dialogue, you need the recognition of the damage, no? And in Spain, nobody recognizes. We need to. I kill people. I don't know. I'm talking about not the Spanish Civil War. Talking about in places far from the front of the war, like my grandfather, people, civilians, only with the occupation of the fascist army in Spain, and they talk during 40 years. We have monuments, streets, silence, oblivion. The silence is full of memory. The silence of the fear of the victims, and the silence of the perpetrators is full of memory. Perhaps we have a antagonistic silence.
Always provoking, Emilio. So we have to leave the building because we are going to switch off the lights, more silent. So we would like to thank you very, very much for quite an intensive day of discussions, and it's difficult to try to connect 3 cases as different as Spain, Poland and Bosnia, but that was actually the reason we chose them, because we can understand memory processes linked to exhumations more directly or more peripherally. It only makes sense if we kind of analyze totally different contexts. So we are very, very helpful that you have traveled to Madrid to talk to us about this, and hope we can continue engaging in the future. We will always tell you when our reports are out and we will start publishing our stuff, we send it to you first thing in the morning. So because we really need your feedback, continue to need your feedback to grow in this project. So thank you very much.